Hi, my name is Martin Purnell and welcome to Off-Grid Christianity, a weekly podcast for those who do or don't go to church and for those that are just disillusioned. We are contactable by email, ogc@accessradio.biz. That's ogc@accessradio.biz, and biz is spelt B-I-Z. Or maybe I should say B-I-Z because we've got an American guest today. Also, please check out our Facebook page, Off-Grid Christianity. Today's guest has a BA in anthropology, and from this she saw a link between food and faith. Having then studied food at Boston University before going to Duke University, our guest wrote a thesis on the theology of bread. The second book is due out in February and is entitled By Bread Alone, A Baker's Reflection on Hunger, Longing and the Goodness of God. It gives me great pleasure to welcome to Off-Grid Christianity, Kendall Vanderslice. Kendall, thank you for joining us. How are you doing?
I am doing all right. It's a Tuesday. It's still feeling like early week. Okay. Well, how about yourself?
Well, it's Tuesday night over here. Thank you for asking. But yeah, I know what you mean. The weather over here has been sort of dank and miserable, and normally is this time of the year. Got rid of the snow at last. What about in North Carolina? What's it like there?
Well, it is thankfully sunny here today, but it is colder than it has been. We had a dreary couple of days and then sudden cold, which is unusual here in January. Yeah. Usually it's really nice.
Do you get snow at all over there in North Carolina?
No. Every now and then we'll get maybe one snow a year, but we haven't gotten any this year.
Oh, well, okay. Great stuff.
Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you for that. I'm looking forward to hearing all about, loads of stuff. No doubt you might mention food as well. Just guessing.
Yes.
Just guessing.
This is my favorite topic to talk about.
Chocolate bar as well thrown in there for good use. So if you're ready then for 5 pertinent questions, if you're sitting comfortably,
yes,
then I shall begin. No conferring. Question number 1, Kendall. If you could invite anybody from history for an evening meal, alive or dead, so that you could ask them questions, who would it be?
So I would have to say Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, who was a 17th century Mexican nun. And I am just fascinated by all of her writing and work and would love to have a meal with her.
Wow. Well, tell me more. Why are you fascinated by that lady whose name I can't remember?
Well, so one of her sort of most famous lines, she had said that if Aristotle would have cooked, he would have written a good deal more.
That's a great line. I like that.
Great. It's great. But I mean, most of her work is really kind of wrestling with the ways that our domestic work, like cooking and such, informs our academic work or our thinking and our writing. And so I agree with her profusely and would love to learn more from her directly.
I'm going out here on a limb. So you say 17th century. I love Mexican food. I love all food, basically. But if we went back to the 17th century in Mexico, would they have been using jalapenos?
I don't know exactly what they'd be eating, but at that point, she was pretty close within kind of the Spanish court. So I think it would be much more of a traditional Spanish diet.
Oh, okay. So maybe not jalapenos.
I'm not really
tomatoes,
sure.
though, they were around about those days, weren't they?
I think so. Yeah. I would think so. Yeah.
I know that if you go back in your time machine to Italy, any time, sort of Roman times, Pompeii or that Vesuvius, you'd never see a tomato because I don't think they were introduced to Italy until about the 14th century, I think.
Fascinating. Yeah. I don't actually know. Are tomatoes a New World plant?
No, nothing about tomatoes. No, a lot about tomatoes, though.
Are tomatoes a New World plant?
Thank you.
I don't actually know.
You.
No problem.
Yeah, I think they were brought back a bit like the potato. Sorry, potato. How'd you say it? Did you say potato or potato?
I say potato.
Good. Yes, quite right.
Yeah.
Quite right. Does anybody say potato?
I don't really think so.
It's just the song.
I haven't heard it before, but
No. Great. Well, thank you for that. I shall listen out for that. What's her name again?
Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz.
Brilliant. That's a great line. I love that. Thank you. Question number 2. Who is your favourite biblical character or favourite biblical story or favourite parable? And I'm just going to go out on a limb here. It's going to be food connected, I think.
How would you ever have guessed? So my favorite, it's a short one. It's just like one little tiny verse in there, but the parable of leaven. The kingdom of the kingdom of heaven is like a little bit of yeast that a woman took and mixed into 3 measures of flour. And I love it because, first off, the imagery of yeast, and I love yeast. But also the 3 measures of flour is about 100 pounds of. Now I'm blanking. I think it's about 60 pounds of flour. Mm-hmm. So the dough would be about 100 pounds of dough that she's mixing all by hand, which means this is so big. 100 pounds is about 50 kilograms that she's mixing with her arms all on her own.
Yeah. Yeah. Incredible. I mean, when you think about it, that, I suppose 3 12-inch pizzas is about a pound's worth of dough. That's a lot of
a lot of pizza.
Isn't it just?
It is.
Wow. That's great. Thank you. Question 3. You can either be Prime Minister for the day or you can be President of the day. What do you want to be?
I'll be President for the day.
Okay.
I've got some things I need to fix here in the US.
Before you come over to us. So if you're President for the day and could change any law, Kendall, or impose a new law even, what would it be?
Well, not to get dark and heavy here, but I think I would do something about gun reform here in the US. Yeah. We got some problems there.
Yes, it was breaking news yesterday, wasn't it? And again today, I think, as well.
And I think it's every day here, really.
Yeah. Good answer. And what would you do, though? That's the thing.
I mean, I would enact common sense gun reforms. Now, whether or not they would actually work and people would not riot in response is to be determined. But background checks, longer wait times in order to purchase. The things that just make sense to me.
Not allowed to carry one on the street as well?
I would prefer not. Yeah, open carry, I would prefer not.
Yeah, you've got a tough job.
Yeah.
You've got a tough job.
I don't envy anyone in that kind of leadership.
No, it's just why you're only president of the day for this one day then, isn't it? Because...
Yeah, just one day and then slip out.
Yeah, slip out.
Make everybody mad and then...
Yeah. Whatever you do, you're going to make people mad, I think. That's the problem, isn't it? Being that high up. But no, it's a very good choice. Thank you. Question 4. Outside of family events, what has been your most enjoyable day out, please, Kendall?
I think any day at the beach. I just love the beach. So I once, when I was, excuse me, when I was 18, I spent some time in the Canary Islands on Tenerife, and a day at the beach there was just beautiful.
What were you doing over there?
The beach and the mountains. I was working for Mercy Ships for a gap year after high school, and so we spent the December and January in Tenerife.
Oh, brilliant. Wasn't the Logos by any chance, was it?
It was not. I was on the Africa Mercy.
Oh, right. Brilliant. What kind of ship is that then? Explain more, please.
So it's a hospital ship. So they operate as a hospital off the coast of West Africa. I was there to bake bread, or I was working in the coffee shop and baking treats for nurses and engineers and teachers and such.
Wow.
So I was not doing the hard hospital work, but what I love to do, making food.
And how long were you on the boat for, ship?
I was there for 7 months.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so kind of one academic year. Took a gap year after high school to do that.
Well, that is fantastic. Fantastic. Great stuff. Thank you. Question number 5 then. I think this is going to be food related as well. Just have a feeling. What has been your most embarrassing moment, please, Kendall?
Oh, man. Well, this one, it's actually not food related, but this was actually also that same year while I was living on the ship. I spent a weekend in Ghana, and my friends and I, we went on it was one of those, between the trees, they suspend the suspended bridges
hammock.
Between the trees.
Oh, no, the
and
tree.
You just you walk the suspended bridges over the forest.
Not a hammock.
No. And while I was there, my pants ripped, and the only thing I had to wear was a pair of shorts. And so I had to wear a pair of shorts all day as we were exploring in Ghana, which was not something that people wear there. And
rope bridge.
Rope bridge. Mm-hmm.
Yes, as seen on Indiana Jones and stuff.
Yes, they're suspended really high.
Yeah.
They're very cool, but yeah.
Were there crocodiles underneath and things like that?
I don't think so. I think we were too far up to be able to see.
Wow.
Otherwise, I probably would have panicked and not.
Yeah, no, that really is high then.
Yeah, it was really high.
Wow, thank you. Well, such a lot to talk about, so little time, Kendall. Let's just get a better picture of you as well, if that's okay.
Yeah.
North Carolina, and you go to university initially to study anthropology. Mm-hmm. Why?
Well, I've always been interested in people and the ways that people interact with one another. And so I think at the core of it was just a fascination with people and cultures. And I later realized that my love of food fit into that as well. But I went into it really, the truth is, I didn't really want to go to college. I knew I wanted to work in the restaurant industry. And so I was like, I just want to go to culinary school and go straight to work. And for a number of reasons, it was just very clear that God was calling me to Wheaton College. And when I got there, I didn't know what to study because all I wanted to do was go work in food. And so I had an advisor who said, go to the bookstore and just look at all the shelves, and whichever shelf looks most fascinating, look underneath it at what's listed, and that should be your major, because essentially your major at a liberal arts school is just what you're going to read for the next few years. And I was just fascinated by every book in the anthropology section. So I studied anthropology.
Did you say Wheaton College?
Yes.
How'd you spell that?
Wheaton.
O-N. Because had it been an E-N, here in Northern Ireland, one of the local delicacies in bread is called wheaten bread.
Oh, okay.
So I could have just said there was a subtle link there.
Well, we still do get the wheat in there. So
yes, you do get the wheat.
Clearly, I'm drawn to the wheat everywhere I go.
Wait to try wheaten bread. It's gorgeous. Absolutely brilliant.
All
okay,
right,
so
I'll
you
have to have it.
Yeah. If only I could send it to you. If only, maybe one day we'll get one of the transporters sorted and we can do that. So there you go. You study anthropology. What happened next then, please?
Yeah, so after I graduated from undergrad, I then planned to go to culinary school. I moved up to Boston, and the day before culinary school was supposed to begin, I had gotten a job at a local restaurant, and my boss said, "Don't go, don't pay for it. You can learn all you need to learn working in the kitchen." So I started working in restaurants and bakeries, and then in that time, I learned about this program at Boston University. It's called a gastronomy program, which is a fancy way of saying food studies. We studied food from the perspective of anthropology, history, literature. So rather than studying culinary school, I realized would be a very limiting sort of way of thinking about food. I would learn how to cook it, but I learned how to cook food in professional kitchens and then learned how to study food in this program at Boston University.
Wow. Do you think your manager at the time, the day before you were going to go, he says, "Stay here and learn"? Do you think, in retrospect, that was the
there might have been a little bit of a little selfish motive there too. The ability to get me on full time instead of just a few hours a week.
But I'm just wondering, because sometimes practical can be far better to learn. Certainly in my case.
Oh, it definitely is. Yeah, no, I'm really glad that I did. In the years since, I've had so many people ask me about my thoughts on culinary school and if they should go. And I almost always say, it's far better to learn in the kitchen than in culinary school. Because if you're someone who is eager to learn, you're going to end up doing extensive reading and researching on your own anyways.
Good
and you
point.
may as well do it in a kitchen. You'll learn a lot more.
And what kind of kitchen was it?
I worked in several different ones, but a handful of restaurants and also bakeries. So more like fine dining restaurants and then some more casual bakeries.
Got you. When did you decide, hey, I'm really good at making pastries, and I want to continue on the pastry theme rather than, I don't know, duck à l'orange or any other exotic?
Well, I always knew I was interested in baking and pastry. I had never had any interest in working on the savory side.
Oh, really?
Yeah. No, it was always baking for me. I actually didn't think I wanted to work in restaurants. I thought I just wanted to work in bakeries. And I had a meeting with a pastry chef in Chicago while I was still an undergrad. She had gone to Wheaton, and so I'd gotten connected with her. She was working for a top restaurant in Chicago at the time. And so she took me to brunch, and she said, "I really think you should at least try one restaurant. Try working for a day, or just for a small season in one restaurant and see if you like it, because it's just a totally different pace." And so I did. That was the first job I found out of undergrad, and I loved it for a short period of time. And then after a couple of years, it drains you.
Would it be fair to say that pastry chefs don't get the recognition that the other chefs get, do you think? Or am I just...
Oh, yeah, definitely not. Definitely not. Yeah, being they sometimes call it like the pastry ghetto. Women are sort of siloed to pastry because they assume that women can't really work in the regular kitchen area, or folks who are working in pastry are considered to be not as skilled or talented or good enough to work on the regular side, which is so ironic because pastry requires so much finesse and so much understanding of chemistry. There's a lot of, education that has to go into it, but oftentimes it is considered it does not get the recognition that the savory side gets.
Yeah, I must admit, not that we ever go to restaurants all that often, if at all, but when we used to, I would always ask if the pastries were made in the restaurant, because otherwise they're just bought in. It's like, so I'm not interested. Anyone can go down and
which is like what most restaurants do these days. Very few restaurants have in-house pastry teams because it's just not considered as it's not considered as valuable, which is really sad.
Well, just that lady's name from the 17th century, the nun from Mexico. If I had my teletransporter and my time machine, I was able to bring her to you, right? And I told you on the QT that she loves desserts and pastries. So do your signature pastry dish. What would it be, please?
Ooh, oh man. Well, now, my main focus for the last 7 or 8 years now has been just purely on bread. So some kind of bread is probably what I would do. I love pastry, but I got burned out of the restaurant world, and now it's all bread all the time.
Okay. Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, I make my own bread here at home, obviously, and my own pizza dough and everything else like that. But it sounds as if I'm just Mr. Basic compared to you. So she's coming over, right? She'll be in about 8 hours. So you've got plenty of time which to do some sort of bread. What would you do?
Oh goodness. Well, I have kind of my signature bread that I teach all the time that I call the bacon pray loaf. And so that's just it's a mix of white and sprouted wheat flour. And then it has a really, really long fermentation, but you can mix all kinds of things into it. So for her, I would probably mix in roasted poblano peppers and white cheddar cheese.
Oh, she's coming here. So if you can send it to us, that'd be
great. Yes, sure. Not a problem. Yeah, you send me the wheaten bread and then I'll send you the poblano white cheddar loaf and we'll call it an even exchange.
I think that's a very even exchange. I think you haggled well there. Thank you.
Perfect.
So, okay. So then you decide to eventually write this book, which I've got here. And of course, if we were on TV, everyone would see me holding up a copy saying, "We will feast, rethinking dinner, worship and the community of God." Kendall, how did this come about, this book?
Yeah, so while I was doing my food studies program at Boston University, I was really driven by the question of what is it about the table that changes the way we relate to one another? What is it that happens when we're eating that kind of shapes conversation and then shapes relationships? And so to study that, to dig into that question further, I did a study on a church in the suburbs of Boston that held its church services around the table. They called themselves a dinner church. And so I spent a semester attending that church, interviewing folks within the church, and really kind of probing at the question of what is it with this context that changes kind of your relationships to one another. And then during that time, I started connecting with a handful of pastors across the country who were worshiping in the same way. And all of them kind of had a different story of what had compelled them to move their church to take place around the table. But it was just a fascinating sort of story that I was interested in. And so I was kind of digging into that research, and I had a publisher reach out and say, "Hey, have you ever thought about writing a book on this topic?" And so that's how We Will Feast came about. So I was really interested, kind of two things. In one, what is the story about, behind these churches? Why are they all starting right now? And then the second was what can we learn looking at what happens when these churches eat together as an act of worship, and how can that inform all Christians and all churches about how they can take hospitality more seriously?
I'm glad you mentioned dinner church, because little rumblings coming over from America that dinner church actually exists, but very few people, I would think, over here know what a dinner church is. So please tell us more.
Yeah, I don't think very many people here know what they are either. It's definitely a very sort of subtle, under the radar thing. But essentially, there are churches that have their whole church service around the table. So oftentimes they will open with kind of the bread portion of communion or the Eucharist, and then they'll move into a potluck supper, and everyone will eat a meal together. And while they're eating, there will be a scripture reading and a short sermon, and the sermon will usually conclude with some discussion questions. And then the bulk of the church service is actually spent in conversation and discussion about the sermon and the scripture reading. And then they'll close with a time of worship through song, and then usually round things out with the cup, be it wine or grape juice, depending on the tradition.
Well worded.
And so it really is kind of a full church service, but taking place over the course of a meal.
How did it come about, do you think, the church?
Yeah, I mean, everyone has kind of different stories behind how they got started. So the first here in the United States that's really known as kind of the first, I think, that is recorded that we know of is St. Lydia's in Brooklyn, New York. And the story there, the founding pastor said that, she had been living in New York and was really frustrated because nobody in New York had an apartment big enough to hold a dinner table. So they couldn't really have dinner parties. And even if someone did have the space for a full dinner table, people are so spread out that it's really hard to get people together on a weekday evening for a meal. Because, if someone lives on one side of town and the other lives on the other, it could take over an hour to get to someone's house. And so she was really trying to think through, like, how do we build community around the table? And at the same time, she was kind of hearing, from all these folks who felt just disconnected from the church and like it wasn't really a place for them. And so she kind of had this question, like, what would happen if I just had a church service around a table and we had this sort of dinner party feeling, but did it as church? And so that was how St. Lydia's got started. There's also a church.
And how many years ago was
Seattle.
This? Sorry.
Oh, goodness. Probably about 15 years ago at this point.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. I'm trying to think exactly when, maybe not quite that much. Time is all a blur at this point.
Tell me about it.
So I think it had been about 8 years when I wrote the book, and I started writing the book about 6 years ago. So I guess, that would be about 14 years. 15 years. Yeah. Yeah. And then there's a church in Seattle called Community Dinners that also, I think, started around the same time. And they function a little bit more kind of like your traditional soup kitchen. So they provide a hot meal for people who have, lack stable housing. And so their dinners tend to be larger, more. So St. Lydia's kind of caps out at about 20 people, whereas the Community Dinners meals are closer to 150 or 200 people. They've got them almost every night of the week in different neighborhoods of the city. And then over the course of that meal, they have a church service. And so it is, they're more focused on meeting the very real need just for food in their community. And then joining the folks who are participating in worship as well.
Got you. Well, this is thinking a few months ahead when it comes to Easter. We're going to be doing a special Off-Grid Christianity Easter edition like we did for Christmas.
Love it.
More about that later on. But one of the questions I'm going to ask our special guests for the Easter party, and I'm not trying to promote heresy, I'm not trying to promote blasphemy at all, but if we take the Last Supper, I always think that is the nearest we're ever going to get to a doner kebab. Because it was unleavened bread, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. And you would have had bitter herbs. It was lamb. Discuss.
Yeah. I mean, sounds delicious. I don't know what else to say other than that sounds tasty.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that far off, I wouldn't have thought, was it?
Yeah, probably not. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I take it, obviously, the flour they had 2,000 years ago and the yeast they would have had, it wouldn't be like the bread we have now, I wouldn't have thought.
No, definitely not. And probably would have been unleavened bread. And so, would have been more like a pita or a cracker.
Exactly.
Type of situation.
Pita bread, yeah.
Yeah.
That's where I get my doner kebab from, you see. So
yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Although actually a pita is yeasted as well. So maybe maybe it would be a little bit more like a cracker of some kind.
Yeah, or a flatbread or something like that. Yeah. Brilliant. So anyway, I mean, how much is that, as far as the Last Supper is concerned, how much is that is like a springboard for what the dinner church are doing?
Oh, I think it's very much a springboard. I mean, the idea is they look a lot to that Last Supper, but then also to the description of the early church in Acts 2, and then also kind of the descriptions we see in Paul's letters to the church in Corinth. And so in each of these contexts, we understand that the church was gathering around the table.
Yeah.
They were eating in one another's homes. And of course, Paul's concern with the church in Corinth was that they were gathering for this meal, and those with means were eating really rich foods and getting drunk, and then those without means were left on the outskirts and to go hungry. And so these meals, these meals that the early church was sharing were meant to sort of subvert the expected order of things, that the traditional sort of dinner parties of the Roman elite were these times of excess and, of establishing elite identity. And these dinner gatherings, these early church gatherings were kind of an inversion of that, a purposeful inversion where they brought together people from a wide range of backgrounds who all ate together at the same table. And so when that didn't happen, Paul got really upset. But so a lot of these dinner churches look back to the early church and say, hey, this is what the early church was doing. Maybe we should pay attention and learn something from it and gather in a similar way today.
So when you go to a church and say, hey, why don't you do a dinner church? What's their normal reaction then, please, Kendall?
Well, so there's usually a lot of curiosity and interest. And I had to clarify a lot throughout kind of writing this book and sharing this book that my goal is not to help other churches become dinner churches. But I do want folks to identify like what is happening here that's really good, and how can that shape our approach to hospitality as a church. And so I think every church has a need to do and an ability to do better in regards to hospitality. That I think eating together as church community ought to be central to our lives as the church, because there is something really important that happens in that process of sharing kind of the mundane practice of eating a meal together, that our lives are shared in a different way. And I think that, our call at the church is not just to worship God through our liturgy or through our music or, through our prayers, but it's to worship God through our engagement with community and our lives together as community. And if the church is not creating the space for that, then I don't think it's doing all that the church is called to do. So generally there is interest and excitement, and certainly, as we've emerged from the pandemic, there's a lot more interest in how do we get people to just come together and sit together and eat together.
Yeah, exactly. And we'll talk about your new book very, very soon indeed. But if we could just finish off on We Will Feast. There's a couple of things in here. One of the things I remember from when I read it last year, pizza, basically. Pass
the peace, then pass the pizza.
It was indeed, yeah. I had to check it out again. It's in Southside Abbey in Chattanooga.
Yes.
You tell a fantastic story about what happened there, so perhaps you could share it today, please.
Yeah, so Southside Abbey in Chattanooga, they are an Episcopal church, and they would gather. At the time that I went to visit them, they did not have a priest, so they would just do their morning prayer liturgy, and they would do it over the course of a meal. And so they had pizza most of the time when they gathered, because the folks who attended were also largely folks with insecure housing, and so they didn't have much say over what they got to eat most of the time. But if they had a choice, it would be pizza. And so the night that I was there, we had pizza, and they'd always joke about how, because they didn't have a priest at the time, they couldn't serve communion, but they had this full meal, and to them it really did sort of they felt the Spirit's presence with them through this meal. But they would always joke that we passed the peace and then we passed the pizza. And so we would pass the peace and then we'd go get a line and have our pizza and have our meal. And it was just a really lovely dinner. And
any pizzas that were left over, what did they do with them?
I don't think there were ever pizzas left over, but if there were, I think the folks who attended got to take it with them.
Yeah. I think, because if I remember rightly, and please if I've got it wrong, but didn't you then share a story? And I've got a feeling it was in California or something like that. And there was like this parking lot, an empty space of land.
Lot, yeah.
Tell us more about it.
Yeah. So this was Garden Church, and they were in San Pedro, California, which is just south of LA.
Right.
And they built their church in an empty lot that was between two buildings in the middle of this little town. And they built a garden, and then they held their church services in the garden. And so they would do work together, worship together, eat together was kind of their rhythm. So folks could come and work in the garden, and then they would shift into a time of worship in the garden, and then they would actually close with a meal together.
So basically, if you came to work, you got fed.
Yeah. Although you didn't have to participate in all three. Some people would come for just one portion or another. So some folks, I think oftentimes they would have folks would start by coming for the work together part. It was kind of a safe entry in, and then they would stay for the worship together, and then eventually they would stay all the way for the meal.
So there you go. There's two things that I remember about the book from a year ago.
That's pretty good. I haven't. It's been even longer since I've read it. So,
well, I'm going to ask you, what's the most abiding memory for you about this book, good or bad, in the writing or what you put in there?
Well, so I was doing the research for this in the fall of 2016 and the spring of 2017, which for any American listeners for sure will remember that as an incredibly contentious time here in the United States. This was the election of Donald Trump in his first few months in office.
His first
tenure.
And so,
yes. And so that was also a time of just upheaval in the United States in general, but especially within the American church, of a lot of confusion from folks who felt like, they didn't understand their church's response to this election, whether it was folks who could not fathom that the churches that raised them could vote for him, or some folks who couldn't fathom that Christians were so angry over his election. And so this was the time of
sorry to butt in, but I read somewhere in the elections that they obviously want to go for the Christian vote. But I got the reading somewhere that most Christians in America don't vote because they feel God is going to sort it all out or something like that. Am I right?
I don't know what the exact statistics are, but I think there's a handful of different sort of philosophies. You have evangelical Christians, I think, have the most political power and that they have the most kind of the largest vote. And so whoever wins them largely is going to win an election. But you do have there a good number of Christians who don't vote, some out of conscience, just believing that they should not vote. Some who don't vote just out of laziness, they don't feel like going. And then some who I think, as you said, just think like, well, God's going to sort it out. So we'll see. Yeah.
So
it is very complex. No worries. Yeah. But yeah, so that time in the American church was really fraught. A lot of folks kind of questioning their faith, questioning their relationship to the church. And it was just fascinating doing this research in that season, because I was visiting all of these churches where, the dominant narrative in the United States was this one of deep polarization and deep division and churches fracturing. But what I was witnessing as I was visiting these churches for this research was churches having really hard conversations and being able to discuss really complex topics in ways that were not being replicated kind of at the larger level. And I think that will always stick with me. And that was really profoundly shaped this book in questioning, what is it that about eating together on a regular basis that makes us more capable of having these hard conversations?
Yeah. I always remember, it's a contentious issue to quite a few people as well still. But I always remember back in England, where we used to live in a little village, there was a pub. And I thought it'd be a good idea to do a Christian outreach in a pub one day. And I had no problems going to the pub, as quite a lot of people do in England, have no problems whether you're Christian or non-Christian. That's what you do. It's a social thing. Yeah, but I also thought I'd invite our vicar to come in and open it up in the pub. And he went in, and as he sat down, he got there quite a bit early, and he said to me very quietly, he said, "Now I know what it must be like for non-Christians to come to my church on a Sunday, because for them to walk through the door into the church," he said, whatever they must be feeling, that's how he felt, because he was teetotal walking into the pub.
Oh, fascinating. Fascinating.
I'm just thinking there's a bit of a correlation there with what you're saying, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, I think there were, there are a lot of folks who would not feel comfortable stepping into a traditional church, who were stepping into some of these dinner churches because they were so hungry for community and so longing for some kind of point of connection. And even though the traditional church might not have felt safe, this dinner church did. Yeah.
And of course, you're breaking bread, which is what Jesus did of us on the Last Supper as well. And there's a quote from you, again in We Will Feast. We will move on in a minute. Or did I get it from your... No, sorry, it's not from your book, actually. It's from your website. Tension existing at the intersection of many different communities. I think that's one of yours.
Yeah, that's me. I talk about that a lot. Yeah, I mean, my work is really focused on working with churches from a wide range of traditions, and also working with folks outside of Christian practice, either folks who've left the faith or, don't feel comfortable in the faith or just have no experience with the faith.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of tension and sort of existing between these different spaces. But also there's a lot of beauty there too. And I think one of the reasons that I love bread so much is that bread exists because of it's entirely reliant on building tension and seeing that this tension is what gives strength and what gives structure and what gives growth to the dough. It teaches me often to not be scared of tension, to understand that we have to handle it with care, but that also tension can be really good.
I like that. I can understand. I mean, I'm very lazy now. I don't knead it with my hands and fingers. I've got a dough hook on my Kenwood Chef, and that does it. But yes, I know what you mean. It becomes more elasticy, doesn't it? And
yes,
it still stays together as one lump.
Yes, yeah. And I mean that gluten is what kind of helps it all stay together. But that gluten is formed in by two amino acids, glutenin and gliadin. And these two amino acids have opposing qualities. One of them likes to stretch and stretch and stretch, and one of them likes to hold its shape. That's called the plastic and the elastic qualities. And so kneading dough is essentially building tension between these two amino acids, getting them to form bonds and then build tension with one another. And then the tension of those two opposing qualities is what gives our strength and structure to our dough.
I knew that.
Yeah, of course.
No, I didn't. I thought an amino acid was a rock band, but I got that wrong. But no, it's true, isn't it? You've got to have people of opposite opinions so you can go on. And who was it? Somebody said on a website on a previous podcast that a bird has a left wing and a right wing. So if you're talking about politics, you have to have a left wing and a right wing. But because you have those two things, the bird can fly straight. And I thought, that's very good. I'm going to use that.
Fascinating. Yeah,
so the same thing here with the bread, isn't it? You have the two opposing amino acids and giving the stretch elasticity, but not too much. Bring it back in so it can be the perfect thing. So next time we go to church and you meet somebody like me, who has got a bit of a gob on him at times and things like that, think actually, no, he could be an amino acid. And I could be the other amino acid. And we'll come together and we'll
balance each other out in the end.
Yeah.
There we go.
That's great. Thank you. Would this then, do you think, give us the unity of the body at the table that you're talking about from time to time in your books?
I mean, that's what I hope will give us the unity of the body. I mean, I guess in the end, it is Christ himself who will give us that unity. Yes. But I think that that is the reason that we're offered bread as kind of the sign of that building of the church.
Yeah. No, that's brilliant. I've got this. I'm cooking with gas now on this. I'm loving it. So then, your new book's coming out at the end of Feb, towards the end of Feb. I don't know when it's going to get released.
February 28th. I don't know when it will get released in the UK.
Yeah. And
hopefully at the same time.
Well, hopefully, certainly with Amazon. And obviously we can do all the puns and how much dough is it going to cost us. Do you have that expression over there in America?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so that's good. So By Bread Alone. Why did you write this book, first of all, then, please, Kendall?
Yeah, so this book has been rising, I guess, if we want to use the bread term puns, in my mind for many, many years. I actually thought that I was going to write this book before We Will Feast. And in retrospect, I'm glad I didn't. It needed a lot of time to ferment and to grow and to build flavor.
Keep going.
But so this book is, I like to say that like the development of this book was very similar to the process of baking bread, that it took a lot of time working it and then resting and then working and then resting. And in the end, I'm so happy with what it is now. But this book, I like to say it's a theology of bread, but as told through my story. And so it is memoir, but it's also theology. And so this book is, it's my own story of kind of how my life and my career and my work as a baker developed. But through that, it ties in various historical and theological sort of aspects of bread to give this larger picture of how God communes with us through bread.
Wow. And I just thought, this sounds really daft, but, we talk about he has risen, and bread you can actually use bread, I suppose.
It rises.
It rises, yeah. And I suppose you can use that, the whole idea of the bread, how it starts off, obviously with amino acids. You can bring so many theological aspects into that, I would have thought.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's so much in there. And, the process of baking bread is this continual sort of series of deaths and resurrections. You have the wheat that's alive that has to die in order to be ground into flour. And then you add the yeast and it comes back to life to become dough. And then this dough has to give up its life to become bread, which then goes on and feeds us. And so you see that sort of imagery of death and resurrection in the story of bread. You see, we have that imagery of the parable of the leaven, that the kingdom of God is like yeast. And there's just so much bread imagery all throughout scripture. And I think I think we can get a lot out of it, even with the basic understanding of bread. But I think the more we understand bread, the more we get out of this bread imagery in scripture.
How many people have actually written on the subject of bread throughout the Bible, do you think?
Not that many. I've been surprised. You would think that it would be a lot more. Well, now I should say in more Protestant traditions, the Orthodox Church has so much theology and deep sort of liturgical tradition and connection to bread and baking bread. So I think they've got a lot more over there.
Yeah.
In the Orthodox Church.
We'll talk about your workshops in a minute, but I'm just thinking, because we call ourselves this podcast Off-Grid Christianity. And it's for those that, going to church or not going to church. And as I said, for those who are disillusioned, they're not angry with God. They're just angry at religion and the way they've been treated by people in the church or outside the church who call themselves Christians, and really hurting. What facts and figures you got so far as the way that you're doing it, the dinner church, for instance, is encouraging people to realise that actually, they need to keep going with their faith?
Yeah, I mean, my goal certainly is to provide a sort of gentle, what's the right way to say this? Just a more gentle sort of picture of how God communes with us, and then also how we rely on and need and grow in community. And so my hope is that this book in particular is a source of hope and a source of healing for folks who feel hurt by the church or hurt by community. That first, it shows them sort of in a very gentle manner the ways that God is present, even in the midst of our hurt and our pain and our disillusionment. But that it also shows the ways that God is present with us through community and the importance and goodness of community, even though community is hard and hurts at various times, the way that it also is a necessary part of our daily lives. So my hope is that folks who read this book, if you're currently in a season of being really disillusioned or hurt by the church, that this itself is a source, as a balm, but that also it maybe will encourage you to find others who also need such a balm. And whether that looks like, finding a home in a church again, or just for now, finding a community of people who can know you and pray with you and care for you. I think that's how God created us to exist.
Or just finding out really that by breaking some bread and having some soup with somebody and they're talking, that they'll just realise that God does actually genuinely love them and He hasn't forgotten them.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So why is it, do you think then, that if you're out for lunch or something like that and someone says, oh look, there's fresh bread there, we all suddenly all light up, oh, we've got to have fresh bread. What's so special about fresh bread?
I mean, bread has been the core of the human diet for most humans throughout most of human history. And I think there's something about it that part of it is just this connection. It connects us to generations after generations of people who've eaten bread. There's also this incredible simplicity to bread. It's at its core, it is 4 basic ingredients: flour, water, salt, and yeast. But also those very basic ingredients can become so many different flavors and textures, and so many different kinds of bread can be made out of those simple things. And I think there's something really beautiful about that just compels us in a way that we can't quite put a name to.
Yeah. So your book, By Bread Alone, was said it's going to come at the end of February. Having written it, having seen it come to production, and it's going to be shipped out via Amazon and other good booksellers and things like that, what have you learned from that process and that book? Or something that you wish, if only I'd put in the book, but you haven't?
Ooh, I don't know if there's anything I wish I would have put in the book. This one, because it was so many years in process. There was so much sort of thinking and rethinking and reshuffling and
right.
shaping, that in the end, I am really, really happy with it. And I don't know that I have anything else that I would want to put in it. But I think that in that process, the thing that really stood out again and again was how important going about things slowly and creating space for rest is in creating something good. That I could not rush this process, just like you cannot rush making a good loaf of bread.
That's brilliant. That is brilliant. Rest, because you need to let the dough rest.
Absolutely.
And I said to you that I make pizza dough, and I actually take now 2 days to make my dough. And I put it in the fridge, and people go, "Oh, what are you putting in the fridge for? It's got to be in a warm place." And going, "No, that's a myth."
No. Mm-hmm. Yeah, long, slow fermentation brings out so much more flavor.
It
and
does.
So a cold or refrigerated fermentation especially can really build so much flavor in your dough.
Yeah, especially if you use Italian flour as well. That gives it
Ooh, yeah. Good stuff.
Oh, guess what I'm doing tomorrow?
Now you're making me want pizza.
Yes. In fact, there you go. What would you rather make for a meal? Would you rather make some fantastic bread, or would you rather make a pizza?
Ooh, well, my go-to meal when I'm having guests over is always soup and bread. But I should do pizza more because it is just so good.
Yeah, especially if you've got a pizza oven as well.
Ooh, yeah. I actually had some friends had me over for dinner this weekend who got a pizza oven for Christmas that they like have a fire pit and then it snaps over the fire pit.
Yeah.
And you can make your pizza. It was amazing.
I bet it was. Now we've got the electric version, which is
nice.
So you've got the stone with the element underneath. Then you put your pizza on top. Then you close the lid with another element in the lid as well. And
cool.
Beautiful. 5 minutes in and out.
Amazing.
Yeah. So I could talk to you about pizza all day, but we won't. We'll talk about your workshops, please, if that's all right, Kendall. What are these workshops all about?
Yeah, so I teach a workshop called the Bake and Pray Workshop, and it is essentially I teach how to bake a loaf of bread, but as a spiritual practice. And so my goal is that other people will also learn to, if not love bread as much as I do, at least to really love the process of baking bread, and understanding how they can meet God in that process as well. So I used to teach a lot of them virtually. It's been less lately as we're doing more and more in person, but I hope in the next couple of months to offer some more sort of open virtual workshops that anyone can attend. But I'm also always happy to join, if a church wants to host a workshop, then I can Zoom in and teach the church how to bake bread. And so those are always fun to do as well.
What's normally the first question that they're going to ask?
Well, everyone is intimidated by yeast. And so I always get the I've made bread and it's always failed, or I'm scared to start making bread. Can you make it not scary? And so my goal is always to make it as unintimidating as possible. But then the other question I always get is, can I do this with gluten-free flour? And sadly, the answer is no, because gluten is the absolute backbone of a loaf of bread. And to make gluten-free bread is an entirely different technique that I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't have that skill. It's a different craft.
Yeah, and when you look on the ingredients of gluten-free bread, the number of different flours that are in there.
Yeah. It's a lot to try and approximate the texture.
It's very, very scientific, isn't it? Because
it is.
Different flours that come together, and obviously to bind and everything else.
Oh, yeah.
And when you then have these workshops, if you want to put the spiritual dimension into it, what would you normally say? And what's normally the reaction?
Well, I mean, there's just so much that I can't even go into it in just a short blurb. The workshop is 2 hours, and almost all of it is kind of digging into the theological components. So, we look at the way the story kind of bread throughout the unfolding of Scripture, the ways that it's used from the story of Genesis 3, kind of the language of bread and the fall and the curse. Onto the stories of manna, God's miraculous provision of manna, and the miraculous provision in the feeding of the 5,000, and then looking at the ways that bread is at play in the Last Supper. So we look at kind of how bread is at play throughout the story of Scripture to see what God is teaching through bread. But then we also look at each of the different elements in bread: flour, water, salt, and yeast, and some of the sort of theological parallels that are present in each of these elements. And then I provide what I actually call a liturgy for bread baking. And so it is a recipe for bread, but it's written as a liturgy, following the evening prayer liturgy from the Book of Common Prayer. And so it is a way of actually baking your loaf of bread as a method of prayer. And so
in what way?
So, I mean, I have a series of prayers to pray, like breath prayers to prayer. So things to pray as you inhale and exhale throughout the process of making the bread, and then reflections kind of in the bread making process, so that you can actually pray through the process of baking bread.
Good. And is this in your new book when it comes out as well?
It is in the new book,
oh,
yes.
Good. By Bread Alone. That was a nice little plug there as well. So after this book comes out then, what is Kendall going to be up to, do you think?
Well, so I run an organization called the Edible Theology Project, and we are an educational nonprofit that helps churches use storytelling about food to facilitate conversations about hard topics. So I like to say kind of our method at Edible Theology is that we help people find kind of their own, first to identify their barriers to gathering at the table with others. What, is it food allergies? Is it being too busy? Is it not having the community of folks that you need? And then our second is helping people identify what we call their food story. What is your relationship to food and how has that shaped you? And then our third step is to actually build community by sharing your story around the table with others. And so I like to say that By Bread Alone is kind of my food story and helping people see the ways that food has shaped me. And then after folks read that, if they want to figure out how to kind of build community like that for themselves, then we've got the resources for you, including our curriculum, Worship at the Table, which is for churches and Sunday schools and small groups to examine kind of, again, the role of food throughout the story of Scripture and throughout their own lives. So I will just keep working on that program and getting it in as many churches as I can. Yeah, because I want to see other people, build this kind of community.
Yeah. What kind of community do you actually want to see then?
A community that is, meets people's real deep loneliness, meets people in their loneliness, is able to engage hard conversations, talk about the things that are driving us apart. Here in the United States, there's just such incredible polarization politically, but also theologically. And, we're seeing that mirrored all throughout the world. And so wanting churches to be spaces that can build community capable of engaging conversation in these hard topics that drive us apart.
Wow. And if a church came to you and said, right, free reign, you can do whatever you want. I'll take the sermon on a Sunday, but you can do what you want. What would you do?
I would just start having meals. My favorite is a meal on the day of the service itself, whether it's like a Sunday lunch or a Sunday dinner. But then also I love a good midweek meal. I think that the church-wide meals on Sundays and then smaller meals in people's homes on a weeknight are just such valuable ways of really building community in churches.
But it's amazing that we go back again to what Morris first started off talking about. This has only been going like dinner church for 15 years. It's amazing that it hasn't happened. Or maybe it has happened. We've just totally ignored it and completely forgotten.
Yeah, well, I think logistically there are a lot of complications in having our actual church services around the table. There's a lot of these dinner churches have struggled to figure out how to support themselves funding-wise, especially because they work best in a really small group. It can't sustain itself through giving as a larger church might be able to. But I do think that what we see in them, that these really thoughtful, intentional meals can really shape community, that can be really valuable for traditional churches to take seriously. And of course, so many churches have had a long history of church meals and potlucks, and so many churches have histories of eating together regularly, and that's just fallen out of practice in the last 20 to 30 years as we've all gotten so busy. And certainly within the last few years since the pandemic has, made it harder and harder to gather with others. And so, I think a lot of churches have dropped the meal portion because it's considered kind of an optional add-on, that like the Sunday morning service is why we're really here, and the community component is considered kind of an optional addition. But I would just urge churches to take seriously that that building community, a community that really hears one another and listens to one another, and that cares for one another, is not an optional add-on for the church. It is central to what it means to worship God in community, that's what we're called to do.
Yeah. I was just, when you were saying that, I was just having a mental picture of all things Second World War, funnily enough. When there was a crisis and the NAFI wagon would turn up, and there'd be cups of tea given out to the firemen and to the army, whoever it was, and they'd just congregate round there knowing that they could have a simple thing like a piece of bread or a cup of tea. But whilst feeding them, they were able just to unwind. Going back to the dough again. The dough takes a long time. It can take as quickly as you want it, or over two days. But you're getting a structure there of all the theological elements that you've been talking about. It's going to be brilliant, but I'm really looking forward to this coming out, actually.
Oh, thank you. I'm looking forward to it coming out, too.
It's
been a long time coming.
Yeah, how many years working on this one?
Oh, gosh. I mean, I started thinking about this one in 2015, I think. So 7 years of thinking about it. I started really writing it in 2018, and then got the contract for it in 2021.
Wow.
So long time.
Wow. And then this is going to be the springboard for getting your Edible Theology out. And hopefully in years to come, we'll be able to meet up again. I'll say, oh, do you remember when we talked about such and,
yes.
Now
I hope so.
Edible Theology and Dinner Church is a household name. It's brilliant. I had a fantastic time listening to you, Kendall. One more thing, if that's all right, to wrap it all up. This has been, by the way, a BCSC production. I always ask our guest of the day to talk about their Christian hero, someone who's preferably not in the Bible. That way, we can learn about somebody else. And the person who's your hero has to be dead. That way, in years to come, if people listen to this, go, oh, yes, but such and such, look what that person did. So, Kendall Vanderslice, thank you again for joining us. Who is your Christian hero, please?
Mine would be Father Robert Farrar Capon, who was an Episcopal priest and food writer, and he was the author of Supper of the Lamb, which is just an incredible, it's called a culinary treatise, but just an incredible reflection on theology of food and a dinner party, and it's just delightful.
Right, and what do you know about this person?
Essentially just that he was an Episcopal priest and he wrote this brilliant book.
I take it when you say Episcopal, that means he's an American.
Yes, he's American. He passed away in 2013. So he actually, I looked it up recently, and it was my very first, I kind of launched a blog after I graduated from undergrad to start writing these reflections on food and theology. And I did not know anything about him. I didn't know his book at the time. And I realized that I launched that blog, I think, within just weeks of his death. And so I like to say he passed the baton on to me. But yeah, his work his writing is just brilliant and also hilarious.
Wow. And where was he based?
In New York.
New York. Wow. And his name again?
Father Robert Farrar Capon. And the book is called The Supper of the Lamb.
Right. We'll have to look out for that one as well. Kendall Vanderslice, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real treat, if I can say that. That wasn't a pun intended either.
It's hard to avoid the food puns when you're...
It is really.
Everything is about food.
Yeah, and
it's been a pleasure to be here as well. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. We'll speak to you again. Thank you, Kendall. God bless.
Awesome.